I'm Julian Rankin. I'm the director of the Walter Anderson Museum of Art. It's a pleasure to be up here in Jackson in the galleries of the Mississippi Museum of Art, a New Symphony of Time, and sharing with you some of these beautiful Walter Anderson watercolors, a little bit about why these are important, why they were made, the significance of them, but also the artist's life and how that connects to Mississippi, both in the past but also in the contemporary moment. So for those of you who don't know, Walter Anderson, Walter Inglis Anderson, his full name, was born in 1903, actually born in New Orleans, but moved to Mississippi with his family, settled in Ocean Springs, and began to create. He came from a family with a mother who herself was an artist. He had two other brothers. He was the middle child. And from an early age, he was an adventurer and a creator at heart. And he actually, people think about Anderson's myth. They know of his ventures to the Barrier Island wilderness, but even as a young man at 16, 17 years old, he capsized his boat out in Louisiana waters and had to cling to a channel beacon for 24 hours. There was a newspaper article about how he was presumed dead. And he actually quoted Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a poem about water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. So even from that early age, he was enacting this mythic quest for his own life. And these watercolors are actually a part of that. So he was a creator in many different media. He was a woodworker, he did block prints, grand murals, but the watercolors were a very private slice of his creative output. And you'll notice in the format of them, they're on 8.5 by 11 typing paper. And the reason for this is these were made on Horn Island or back on the mainland after being out in nature, in the elements. And so he wanted to bring humble materials to the island. They were easier to carry, of course, but also these were not made to be in museums. Actually, the anecdote goes that if he were on Horn Island and needed kindling for a fire, he would rather burn a finished watercolor than a blank sheet of paper, the blank sheet having that possibility for another connection. And so these, many of them were burned or discarded, and the records of these are even more priceless and visionary for the fact that they do exist. And so if you look at them closely, you'll notice that they're very fluid in stroke. He was oftentimes trying to capture the flight of a bird, and they are these momentary glimpses beyond the veil of what for him was a pretty soul-sucking modern world. He left what he called the dominant mode on shore, sort of his words for talking about the circuitry of everyday life, having to obey the ticking clock, clocking in, clocking out, all of this machination that he was experiencing. But these really signal to people that there's more to the artworks themselves than the physical material. It's about a way of living. So when people look at the watercolors, that's something I hope they take note of. So these are an interesting selection here. There's a couple that I wanted to draw your attention to. This landscape here at Horn Island in the fall is interesting too, just to talk about the flora. So we think about Horn Island, those of you who might have read about Anderson, many of his encounters, whether with a benevolent alligator or talking about pelicans, his favorite bird, these are a lot of them are fauna, but flora was really important to him as well. And of course, these are signifiers of nature's regeneration, the implicit engineering of nature, and a lot of those forms in Anderson's art, whether we're talking about an archetypal spiral or the lines that he uses in waveforms, these are taken from nature. And he was very aware of, again, how nature was the ultimate artist, but also how it modeled, a way of existence and innovation that people and societies could benefit from. If you think about, if you go out to Horn Island, a lot of times the sun is blazing and the colors are all washed out, but if you were to stay overnight, like he did many times, there would be a time of day towards the evening, which he called the magic hour at sunset. And he said that it was during this time that all things were related color. So if you'll look at, for example, the bark in this loblolly pines work here, you'll see so many different colors changing in and out. There actually are some, not pictured here, but there are even some where he has pelicans gathering around stumps, and the forms of the pelicans mimic those of the stumps, and they almost become interchangeable. Again, this idea that the flora and fauna are not separate, just like man, humanity, and nature are not separate. They're intertwined, ever-changing, exchanging. If you think about trees, almost knowledge, the way that the substructures and rhizosphere of trees sort of talk to each other, if you will, but also that animals, taking again fallen nuts plants or pollination, from butterflies. All these things are interacting with each other. So these watercolors, again, are really the most visionary examples of Anderson's work. If you come and see the murals, those are other examples, but these are the ones that can be collected and traveled. And when people look at them, I hope they realize that these are records of a moment in time that transcend that moment in time. So one example that is useful to look at here, and we'll talk about form and composition a bit here, but these snakes are a good example of when you see these watercolors in their format, 8.5 by 11 typing paper, how he manipulated and worked within those constraints. And that was another interesting thing for Anderson. There's this idea that we all come from a place, and for him, Mississippi was a very defined place, but yet it opened up these conversations of, again, the cosmic, the universal. But here, in terms of his technique, he's fitting things within the composition. So there's a couple things at play. You see how the snake the serpentine motion fits within the page, and there's several of these in his collection that do this, and it just is an interesting way that he plays with form. If you think about his illustrative qualities as an artist, he often would have very fluid motions of human arms and so forth. Of course, a snake is already a very fluid moving animal, but the way that he fits it onto the page is really interesting and indicative of the page. I think he was aware of the constraints of 8.5 by 11 typing paper, and that's part of what's really interesting about them, is that he did not opt to use a larger format, even though he was talking about large ideas. The other thing that I think is really important about all of his art, especially the watercolors, and this one that we're looking at here, is his use of negative space, and also color as well, but the negative space being very important for him too. If you think about presence versus absence, when he was on the island, this idea of isolation that he was feeling was actually in service to a unity that he was seeking. And so although he was perhaps the only person on the island at many times, he felt very much in tune with things that are larger than himself, and he always played with this idea of positive and negative to really showcase, what's important on the page, or even in terms of the more kind of personal way of living, his philosophy. What's important is not necessarily to focus on everything all at once, but to pick out things that are important and signify them by pulling them off the negative space and leaving that alone. But it's also a function in a pragmatic way of the fact that he made many thousands, tens of thousands of watercolors, and many a day. And so a lot of these, as I mentioned earlier, weren't meant to be finished works of art, perhaps, that would signify every possible technique he had, or even that were thought out beforehand. These were things that were made in the moment. So he would often sketch something out in pencil, he might paint it in later, and after he did that, after he found that it had an essence of what he was seeking, he would discard it or put it away and go on to the next one. So this one is a good example of several of those things. These were done from life. He was very close to these animals, once bitten by a cottonmouth on Horn Island, famously. And so he knew how these things moved. These are in some ways prehistoric things. They exist after a long line of evolution and harken back to even the Garden of Eden, for example, and Horn Island being Walter Anderson's Eden. He actually referred to Horn Island once as the back of Moby Dick, like the white whale, as if it itself was a creature. So it's been a real pleasure to spend this time with you in the galleries here, and again, we hope you do visit the museum, the Walter Anderson Museum in Ocean Springs. What we try to do is to keep Anderson's legacy alive, but also to recast it in the contemporary landscape. A lot of our work happens beyond our walls, in nature, programs on Horn Island, in communities near and far. And so I think what Anderson would say, and if you read his writings, this is echoed there, is that he wanted us all to cultivate an awareness, a change of perspective, to look from nature rather than look at nature. And that's what's present in these watercolors, is what's present in all of Anderson's work. And also that beauty is something that we all, whether we're artists or not, can orchestrate in our own lives, and that it's something that should be lived in everyday life. So if you think about the furniture he made, or the block prints that he propagated and carved, these were the results of this idea that he had a commitment to the community and the public, to contribute to civic understanding, but also to giving us, as the viewers and as the participants in his work, an idea of something larger than ourselves that we could then put into play in our own lives, to live more creatively and with beauty. And that's what we, again, celebrate about Anderson, but also celebrate about the kindred artists who are making work every day in that same spirit. So please come see us, and we hope you all have a beautiful rest of your day.